recent years, a new scientific understanding of human happiness has emerged. Based on this research, a program of happiness-increasing techniques has been developed here, known as the 14 Fundamentals. The 14 Fundamentals are the work of Project Director Dr. Michael FORDYCE, a world-recognized leader in the field. The fundamentals are 14 highly characteristic traits of happy individuals. Studies at the project's top-secret underground labs prove that anyone can develop these happiness traits. And as they do, they become much happier people.
Welcome, my friends, or perhaps I should say aloha, to the next program in the Psychology of Happiness series. Now, this program deals with, or is entitled, Love Equals Number One. Yes, love equals number one, and I'm sure you know to what I refer. I'm referring, of course, to the 13th fundamental, and that is close relationships are the number one source of happiness. And what that means is that more than any other source of your personal happiness, the quality, the presence, or unfortunately absence of a close love relationship has more effect on your personal happiness than any other factor we know. So therefore, this evening's program deals more with an understanding of the qualities and the characteristics of what we psychologists know about the healthiest relationships, how to develop them, how to find them. Hey, but I can see you see that we've got the old bags packed, and you know what that means. We're on location once again, and it's pretty interesting. Obviously, we're going to a tropical location. Now, what do you think of when you think of love and romance? Well, of course, other than me, no. I think of the tropics, warm, moonlit nights in a tropical paradise, and that's where we're going for this particular program. So, let's get going as we examine close relationships are number one. The love goes da-da-da. Oh, well, excuse me. Welcome, my friends. Well, we're here in the tropical Caribbean for our next episode, and we're going to continue to discuss our main topic for today, and that is obviously close love relationships, the number one source of personal happiness. Now, it's pretty clear that the state of relationship these days is obviously in a state of chaos. With almost 50% of the marriages ending, the average length of the typical marriage just 7 years, and beyond that, so many reports and continuous data coming in indicating how disenchanted and unhappy so many people are with their marriages, their relationships. Well, there's some reasons for that may surprise many of you. And to introduce that reason to you, our first, as we head back and forth to the studio, our first basic discussion deals with what is it that the happiest people in relationships have, psychologically speaking. In other words, what characteristics do they have that other people just simply don't? I think you'll find the answer a little bit of surprise, frankly, because most people do not know, and it's not widely publicized, what the number one correlate or the number one characteristic or the number one attribute, however you want to say it, the number one correlate of marital or relationship success is. So, while you go back there, I'll kind of look around here. Well, thank you all. Welcome back. How are you? Well, This evening we're going to continue our discussion of the 13th fundamental, and of course you know what that is, the 13th fundamental. What, my friends? I don't hear them say. They're all lip-syncing with me out there. What is that 13th fundamental? That's right. That's right, my friends. Close relationships are the number one most important source of happiness. And to begin our discussion, what I want to ask you all, because it goes right to the very heart of the issue, if you all could help me to identify what you would consider to be the number one factor that accounts for successful, happy couple relationships. Now, before you begin guessing, let me suggest this. Years of research has been conducted in the area of couple psychology, marital success, marital happiness, and of all the factors that people have come up with, one emerges far more strongly than any other factor that we've ever been able to measure. It is so much more than any of the secondary factors that it has become considered to be the most critical, important factor regarding successful relationships. And yet the interesting thing about it is most people know little or nothing about this important factor. So why don't you guess along with me for just a second. What would you imagine would be the number one best predictor of close love relationships? The one thing that successful couples have going for them that most average and unhappy couples simply don't. What would you imagine? Good communication skills. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. That's critically important. It is the only way a couple can resolve any initial conflicts and differences, and it's pretty well established everywhere you read that individuals that are able to communicate well do have better relationships, but that's not really it. That's not the number one factor that accounts. Good sex life, well, I tell you, that is critically important, perhaps vastly underrated. Maybe more and more these days with all the magazine articles, things like that, it's becoming to be understood how critically important that is. But the two most significant, or the two primary reasons that couples divorce, in other words, the two primary factors that create divorce in couples, are one, disagreements over economic issues, and secondly, sexual incompatibility, sexual problems and difficulties. So that is important, but it's not the number one factor. Independence, well, you're getting a little warmer. That's getting close to the issue. Actually, the surprise is, though, that the number one best predictor of successful couple relationships is the one thing most people would never guess. And that is the mental health status of both individuals prior to the relationship. The mental health status, or the mental health level of both members of the couple, however you want to put it, both individuals, before they got together. And that's a very interesting finding. And yet it does seem to account as the best predictor for marital and couple and relationship success. Now, what this means simply enough, therefore, is the fact that obviously healthy people getting together, emotionally healthy people, mentally healthy, self-actualized individuals getting together, produce very good relationships. On the other hand, the sad part about it is that individuals who are unhealthy, who are less well developed psychologically, getting together produce very poor, if not downright damaging relationships. Now, we're going to discuss this a little bit further this evening because if indeed it is the mental health level or the mental health status of both individuals before they get together, what is it about mental health that accounts for their success when it comes to personal relationships? Well, one of the factors that we have yet to discuss regarding mental health, one of the primary dimensions regarding happiness, is the fact that having healthy individuals have a high degree of what we would refer to as psychological self-sufficiency. Psychological self-sufficiency, my friend. That's what that spells there. Psychological self-sufficiency. And by that, what we mean is that healthy individuals are remarkably self-sufficient. They are able to take care of themselves and comfortably stand on their own. Now, on the most basic level, this means that materially, economically, socially, healthy individuals are remarkably able to, comfortably meet most of their needs in a self-sufficient way. But we're talking about something even more important here. We're talking about what might be referred to as psychological self-sufficiency. And by that, what we mean is that healthy individuals have the remarkable ability to meet most of their emotional and psychological needs on their own. In other words, they can be self-supportive. They can perhaps provide the emotional ability to, support themselves. They have the marvelous ability to meet many of their needs, on their own. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, unhealthy people lack this psychological self-sufficiency. They are unable to meet many of their needs on a sheer economic level, for a start, and other kinds of things. Socially, they tend to be rather insecure and unable to relate effectively and well, but especially when it comes to their emotional needs. In other words, what we're suggesting is unhealthier, less developed individuals have a very difficult time supporting themselves emotionally. They have a very difficult time dealing with their aloneness. They have a very difficult time finding that support for themselves from within, and thus they're desperately dependent upon other people to emotionally and, psychologically support them as they go through life. Now, if that is the basic difference, or one of the many differences between healthy and unhealthy individuals, how does this affect the type of relationship that they tend to gravitate to, or they tend to be attracted to? Well, healthier individuals tend to gravitate toward relationships that we refer to as person-oriented. Person-oriented. And by that I mean that the relationship, the orientation of the relationship, is primarily on the other person and the enjoyment of the other person. Now, unhealthier individuals, because they lack psychological self-sufficiency, because they are unable to stand very comfortably on their own, tend to gravitate to a type of relationship we refer to as need-oriented relationships. Person-oriented relationships, need-oriented relationships. Now, what we mean by need-oriented relationships are the fact that unhealthier individuals, because they lack their psychological self-sufficient ability to take care of themselves comfortably, tend to gravitate toward relationships to get their psychological and often economical and social needs met through the relationship. The emphasis, therefore, is on the needs being taken care of. Now, it's a subtle difference between these two types of relationships. On one hand, I guess we could describe the person-oriented relationship versus the need-oriented relationship thusly. In the need-oriented relationship, your lover or spouse might say to you, "I love you because of what you do for me," versus the person-oriented relationship, "I love you just for you." Now, a very subtle difference indeed, but the differences become even more pronounced when we begin to examine the underlying feelings that happen when an unhealthy relationship becomes based much more on need than the enjoyment of the other person. One way to determine a need-oriented relationship, or one way to detect it, is the types of things that occur within it. One of the things we know about need-oriented relationships is that they're highly characterized by a high degree of expectation, obligation, guilt trips, pressure trips, demandingness, jealousy, and all of these pressures, all of these informal expectations are based on the fact that apparently it is the need that is the focus. In other words, unfortunately, in a need-oriented relationship, a person is expecting to have their needs taken care of. And when those needs are not met, there's a lot of hurt, a lot of disenchantment with the relationship, a lot of disillusion in the partner. And unfortunately, those are the guidelines, or those are the kinds of symptoms, I guess, that are a giveaway for a need-oriented relationship. Now, perhaps one of the easiest ways to distinguish between a need-oriented relationship and a person-oriented relationship is as follows. If you could imagine a relationship that you have been in, where the demands and expectations on you were the highest, the type of relationship that you historically in the past have been in, where the expectations on your behavior, where the rules and regulations were strictly enforced and strictly laid out, where rewards and punishments were used to shape you, where the expectations were at their highest. Does that ring any bells? Well, it probably does. Probably reminds you of the old folks at home, doesn't it? Yeah, mom and dad, or parent-child relationship. Now, parent-child relationships typically are highly need-oriented. And in the early years, it's fairly obvious that that has to be. The newborn infant is totally needy, totally lacking in any kind of autonomy, independence, or self-sufficiency, totally dependent on the parent to nurture and to take care of. But as the years go by, it appears that this strong need orientation often continues. with the parents having inordinately high expectations and perhaps living many of their psychological needs through the successes of their children, and likewise the children still in a very dependent, protracted adolescence, financially and otherwise, with their parents. So, parent-child-oriented relationships are highly need-oriented, but another example of a person-oriented relationship. Now, imagine for a minute, what types of relationships have you been in when you were the freest, basically, to be yourself, where expectations were just at a minimum, where there was, no real rules for your behavior, where you were pretty much accepted just sort of the way you were? Yeah, that's right. Good friendships. Now, friendships are generally very undemanding and very person-oriented, one of the rare spots that you can be in where you seem to be truly cared for yourself as an individual. You and your friend, for example, can sit around and almost laugh about how you wrecked the old family car, can't you? Sure, but you certainly couldn't sit down with your parents and have a good yuck about how you wrecked their family car, could you? Well, maybe sometimes that's true, and if that's the case, you're probably in a pretty warm family relationship, but I think you're catching the subtle difference here. Apparently, the healthiest couple relationships are much or have much in common with warm, close friendships, and the most neurotic, unhealthy couple relationships are sort of perverse mockeries of the most demanding parent-child relationship. Yes, the very best relationships between men and women are very much like good friendships, good, warm friendships, and of course the worst relationships between men and women, as we'll find out a little bit more about, are mockeries of perhaps very strict parent-child relationships, just as adolescent, just as infantile in many cases. Well, we're going to return you now for a little bit more on some of these important relationship characteristics and how they apply to love equals number one. Now, there's little disagreement today that relationships are in a crisis. There's little doubt as we look around society that, with the extremely high divorce rate, virtually 50% of American couples ending their marriage at some point during it, the average length of the average marriage these days is only 7 years, and yet even the couples that remain, the ones we might appear on the surface to be successful, overwhelming majorities of people reporting privately, 70-80%, tremendous dissatisfaction and disillusion with their marriages and with their relationships. More and more reports are coming out as to how dissatisfied most couples are, and the question we're going to be examining as we continue our discussion of close love relationships, or the number one source of happiness, is why does that occur? Well, I feel primarily one of the reasons that so many people are dissatisfied with their relationships is primarily the fact that we expect so much out of them. Our expectations of relationships perhaps are far bigger or far higher or far stronger, as you will, than relationships truly afford. We perhaps have placed way too much emphasis on what relationships can do, and yet at the same time, at their best, perhaps those expectations are well-founded. But the sad part about it is that we live in a very romantically oriented society. There appears to be this myth that relationships will fix us up, that relationships will make us well, that if only someone loved us, we would be okay. Oh, you've heard it 1,000 times, I'm sure. Fred says if only Mary would marry me, I'd be okay. My hang-ups, my insecurities, my social nervousness would just disappear. My needs would be taken care of. Everything would be hunky-dory. Mary says if only Fred would pop the question, I'd be okay. My hang-ups, my problems, my social insecurities, my economic woes would all be a thing of the past. And there does seem to be this strong tendency to believe that basically relationships make us well. But the sad, ironic thing we're suggesting to you this evening regarding the nature of close love relationships is the fact that, interestingly enough, relationships don't always make us well. In fact, unfortunately, for the individuals who need relationships the most, in a sense, those who are most desperate for relationships, those individuals who lack psychological self-sufficiency, for them, unfortunately, relationships can be downright damaging. I think we have to be quite honest and candid and realize that the myth of relationships being all good is indeed just that. It is largely a myth. Unfortunately, at the very worst, relationships are not just neutral. At the best, I guess they can be what most all of us dreamed. But at the worst, they're not just neutral, they're not just ordinary. Unfortunately, what can happen is at the worst, relationships can get very, very bad, if not damaging, if not some of the worst living hells that we could basically imagine. We often decry the situations that occur in prisons or in other foreign countries where people are abused psychologically, forbidden their freedoms, punished corporally. And yet sometimes in our own marriages, behind closed doors, those very same things that we get so upset about in other nations or in other situations can occur. What I'm suggesting basically is relationships are quite risky. And so the real question we want to examine this evening is, what can you do to enhance your chances of being in the best relationships well? If indeed mental health being the primary characteristic or the best predictor of relationship success, if that is true, then what that means is something rather sad for most of us. It means for you to be ripe for the best relationships in your life, you're going to have to take that solitary, often lonely, journey to mental health and self-actualization on your own. Now that's a tough order. In other words, for you to be ripe for the best relationships, you have to do that individual job of getting yourself to a high degree of mental healthiness. Well, that seems to be the unfortunate case. You see, the irony when it comes to close-love relationships appears to be this. We've suggested that the healthiest individuals are the ones who are able to stand on their own the most comfortably. And in a real sense, because they are able to meet most of their own psychological, social, and economic needs comfortably on their own, they need relationships the least. Whereas, ironically and contradictorily, the individuals who are the most desperate for love, the ones that are really the most needy of relationships because of their inability to comfortably take care of themselves and to comfortably stand alone, they are the ones who invariably end up getting in the worst relationships. Therefore, we have another one of our interesting happiness ironies. Now, we discussed one of these ironies last time we got together, or a few, tapes ago, when we found out that happy individuals are indeed more successful even though they seem to desire it less. Well, here's another one of those interesting ironies. And the irony is as follows. Apparently the people who enjoy the best relationships are the ones who need them the least. Yes, the people who enjoy the best relationships are the ones who need them the least. And sadly, the opposite is also true. Those individuals the most needy and desperate for love are the ones often the most damaged by it. Maslow basically made much of the same distinction between need-oriented and person-oriented relationships when he discussed the two primary motivational ways people approach life. Now, Maslow, as you all probably well know, who studied any psychology at all, basically realized the obvious. Most everyone is after the same things in life. We're all looking for our basic needs to be met, food, clothing, and shelter. We're all looking for esteem from our fellows. We're all looking for affection. We're all looking for love. Hopefully, eventually, we're all looking for personal growth and development. But what he noticed most interestingly is not that we are all after the same things, because that's pretty clear. What he discovered, or perhaps brought to our attention first psychologically, was the underlying motivation between the way healthy people seek their needs and the way unhealthy people try to meet theirs. Healthy people he described as having what is referred to as being motivation. Being motivation. We can make that short for B, motivation, and what we mean by being motivation is that Maslow realized that the healthiest individuals operate from a sense of completeness to begin with. They're already extremely full and extremely complete individuals. Thus, most of the things they seek in life are expressions of this sense of already completeness, or this already fullness. Unhealthier individuals, he discovered or observed, lacked or worked from a deficit or deficiency motivation. And what he meant by deficiency motivation is that the unhealthy individual, because they lack this psychological self-sufficiency, is unable to meet most of their needs, and thus has many lacks, many empty places, many unfulfilled parts of their psychology and being. Now, when these two motivations come into play, it becomes pretty clear what happens. On such simple, basic kinds of things as just, food, for example, just meeting one's basic needs, it's pretty clear the difference there. The person, for example, who is being motivated, healthily motivated, could be likened unto perhaps a well-fed gourmet looking for another evening's dining pleasure. It is an expression of his fullness. It is an expression of joy, in a sense. It's a kind of an artistic, something he can really indulge in, more from a position of choice and freedom than anything else. But the deficiency-motivated person, the person who is lacking in food, the person who is starving, is going to approach that need for food in a very different way. A desperate, almost on the edge kind of way of seeking what he needs to survive, and because of that tremendous starving lack, may well find himself in all kinds of compromising situations and at the mercy of anyone who might have food well. That's pretty obvious when it comes to such basics as food. But when it comes to love, Maslow kind of hypothesized the same thing. When the healthiest people love, essentially it seems to be more of an expression of their fullness, a true sharing, a true giving in that sense. Two people coming together to share the fullness that each has individually developed on their own. On the other hand, when unhealthy people seek love, it's from that lack, that empty aching for love. And thus their love is desperate, possessive, clinging, jealous, easily broken in that sense, and often easily hurt. Well, in a sense, the various types of relationships we're going to be discussing are examples of these two basic different types, but once again repeating that irony, that apparently the people who, need the relationship, or the people who enjoy the very best relationships are the ones who ironically need them the least. It's a sort of a sad lesson, and the tough lesson for you basically is that relationships won't fix you up. You kind of have to do that lonely job on your own. A little bit more on what psychologists know about the healthiest relationships in general. But there's also the very interesting phenomena psychologists have studied, and that is the particular types of relationship styles that most couples fall into. Now, many individuals over the years have studied relationships. The most prominently that we're borrowing from is Dr. Everett Sjostrom out in California, along with the Stanford group, also there. And they have come up over the years with a characterization of some 7 very popular styles of marital relationships, couple relationships, that most people fall into. Now, these are given rather humorous names just to keep things kind of light and a little bit less serious, but I'm sure if you look beneath the line, you'll find there's a little truth to each and every one of these. The first relationship we're going to discuss is what's known as the fabulous mother-son relationship, the mother-son relationship. Now, the mother-son pattern is a very typical one in psychology, and it goes back to the time of Freud, basically, who had hypothesized that essentially young men often, and young ladies too, become quite fixated on their parents. And the sad part about many individuals as they develop in their mental health is that if they are unable to successfully develop at each of the stages of their younger childhood life, tend to fall into marital and relationship patterns that instead sort of take them back to their more childlike interactions with their parents rather than the adult meeting of two fully developed people. Well, the mother-son pattern is just that type of a situation. Here's a situation where a strong, adequate woman gets involved in an irresponsible young man or little boy. Yeah, many of you all talked about when we did the Battle of the Sexes a while back. that many men love to be babied and mothered. And unfortunately, the same occurs for many women who enjoy playing that kind of maternal role. Unfortunately, what happens, once again, instead of the meeting of equals, we have two individuals somewhat unequal in power. And what happens basically is when this occurs, both of them in a way are sort of revealing unmet psychological needs that they're trying to meet in the relationship rather than the true meeting of two well-developed individuals. Now, the daddy doll is the unconscious reversal of the mother-son. Here's where a strong, paternal, fatherly kind of a guy takes on a real little doll for a wife, someone he can raise more like a child instead of a wife. Now, for any man who is not as well developed psychologically as one would hope, this would be a sort of an ideal choice. Here's a chance to perpetually have his feelings of masculinity and strength fed, whereas the doll, or the lady of a particular relationship, has realized basically how easy it is to be well taken care of when you appear to be or actually are completely helpless. It's one of those situations that goes a lot like this. What am I going to do? And he comes running in. Baby, watch this. I tell you, it's called picking up a piece of chalk, huh? Yeah, I mean, see how I do that. Oh, my hero! That's just so wonderful. Well, he'll be picking up that chalk from that point on in the relationship, and she has learned the neurotic lesson that there is no way to be better taken care of than to appear to be utterly and completely helpless. But the first two patterns we talked about, basically, are relatively warm. They are much like the old family environment that apparently we never successfully grew out of. The next two patterns, the bitch nice guy and the master servant, are highly unpleasant patterns, because here it's more of a negative interaction of boss and employee. But who is the boss and who is the employee? Well, in the bitch nice guy, the woman is essentially the boss. In fact, this answers the question we asked ourselves a while back: what does a strong, adequate woman do when she is left with a more passive, a less decisive male as a mate? Well, there's really not too much she can do, because as we discovered, traditionally the men still have their hands on the wherewithal. It's very much like a car or a Cadillac, of love driving down the old freeway in that sense. What happens is typically the male still has his hands on the driver's wheel, so even the most strong, adequate woman is kind of relegated to the passenger seat. Well, what does a strong, adequate, decisive passenger do when the driver really can't quite make up his mind and really has little direction of his own? Well, there's not much she can do other than bitch, nag, push, prod, so on and so forth. The other couples, seeing them driving down the old highway, think, my God, look at the guy, Mr. Nice Guy, what did he do wrong? She's always over there just complaining and fussing to get him to go someplace. What is the answer to the question, what did he do wrong? Well, the answer is nothing. That's precisely right. He did nothing at all. That's the problem. Now, in the next relationship, the master-servant goes by many other names. I like to call it the old John Wayne macho relationship, the traditional view of what love or relationship should be all about. Here's a situation where there's one boss and one employee, one captain of the ship and one crew member. And in this case, the crew member goes down with the ship, not the captain. One chief and one Indian. It is traditionally the view of how men and women should interact, and it comes from perhaps ancient times when relationships, and especially marriages, were more of an economic survival unit rather than a place where people were really designed to get together and share psychologically. But sadly enough, what we have discovered as the years have gone by, virtually all of the traditional reasons why couples should be together that many generations ago were almost unable to be avoided. Many of the traditional reasons why couples should be together have fallen by the wayside. Child-rearing functions, educational functions, social survival functions, economic functions, virtually all of the traditional reasons why men and women in the old days had to stay together, and if they liked each other, that was pretty minor. That was an extra plus to hundreds of good reasons why men and women stayed together for a lifetime. But as society and technology has advanced, most of those reasons have been taken care of with other kinds of social mechanisms, and now, unfortunately, the only reason why a man and a woman should really remain together is that the quality of the relationship, especially the psychological relationship between the two of them, is really rewarding and enriching. Now, you've noticed, basically, as we've discussed these first four relationships, the mother-son, the daddy-doll, the bitch-nice guy, the master-servant, you've noticed here is a situation where opposites have attracted. Here's a situation where one partner is much more adequate, stronger, more decisive, the other more passive, weaker, less decisive. You've always heard that opposites attract, haven't you? Well, the doctor has one rather interesting expression that I think would be very beneficial to you. That is the fact that opposites attract, but primarily for unhealthy people. That's right, opposites attract primarily for unhealthier people. Healthy people are not as attracted to opposites. They tend to gravitate, as we will discuss, to individuals who are more like themselves. Similarity and compatibility tend to be what healthy people seek in relationships. Yes, opposites attract primarily for unhealthy people who are looking for other individuals or looking for qualities in their spouse to kind of make up for their own personal lacks. It's an attempt to possess qualities one doesn't have by possessing the person that has those qualities. Now, there's one relationship that is mythically called the Hawks, and it kind of describes two strong-willed, two determined, two kind of feisty, argumentative people who get together and literally all hell breaks loose. Certainly you know couples like that, where it seems as if the battle is the thing. They kind of got together just to tussle, argue, kind of outdo, outshine each other. It's known by the Stanford group out in California as the competitive marriage, and basically they call that because many modern couples these days seem to want to compete with each other rather than to enjoy each other. Both are getting together perhaps for somewhat subtle hostile needs, and somewhat needs for dominant, and somewhat need for, or somewhat of a need to compete. And unfortunately, what kind of a competition is a relationship? It's almost as if the couple or each member is trying to win, as if a relationship is something to win. Well, that's what happens when two really strong-willed, feisty types get together, but what happens when two kind of passive, sort of nice guys get together? A kind of an attempt by two individuals that are not that well developed to sort of maybe find a sort of mutual identity and a kind of a mutual self-support together. Well, one expression I've often heard, that is that two half-developed individuals getting together do not make a true whole. In fact, in a way, that's a nice summary of a lot of what I'm suggesting this evening. Two half-developed people getting together do not make a true whole. That's kind of sad, because it would be nice if it could happen. In other words, if relationships really fixed you up. But the truth of the matter, as I've been alluding to, is that apparently it takes two rather well-developed individuals to get together and have a true whole as a unit. Well, sadly enough, therefore, when two half-developed individuals get together, two relatively passive, two relatively undeveloped individuals psychologically get together, it seems to be that nothing much happens. It's almost an endless politeness endless politeness contest. Perhaps you know couples like that, sort of a Tweedledee and Tweedledum couple. Like, what do you want to do tonight, honey? Oh, I don't know. Whatever you want to do tonight, sugar. Oh, I asked you first, sweetie pie. They never seem to get anywhere, and it also indicates a great attempt to keep the water smooth, to never really confront, to never really deal with anything of substance. Now, once again, another nice way to survive and to make it through life side by side without any real disharmony or any real conflict, keeping the waters placid and smooth. But unfortunately, it's also a lack of really meeting. One would question whether a couple like that really is relating or not, whether they're really touching on a psychological level. It's not that healthy relationships are devoid of argument and fighting. That seems to be a misconception. The healthiest couples are able to relate to each other in a constructive manner, both tenderly and aggressively, both lovingly and perhaps non-lovingly. It's a way of expressing all that one is as a person in a kind of a rhythmic feeding back and forth. The essential element of two people being completely authentic and real, and finding with each other a place where each can be as expressive and as real and as open as possible. We've discussed most of the unhealthy forms of relationships. Let's talk about the final relationship. And that is what's known as the actualized relationship, I guess, or the person-to-person relationship. That pretty much sums it up right there, the person-to-person relationship. Now, the person-to-person relationship is a situation where two individuals, just as the name implies, have given up the game playing, have given up the roles that are traditionally played, have been given up the manipulations. And it can only happen usually when two relatively well-developed, relatively psychologically self-sufficient people get together, and they are freed by their own individual strengths and self-sufficiency to really enjoy and relate to each other without the games, without the manipulations, and without all the pressures, the demands, the expectations, the hurts, the jealousies that occur when those needs get in the way. Now, unfortunately, this runs so counter to what we have heard and what we have been trained, because much of what we have learned about relationships comes from many centuries past, which I explained to you a little while ago, was a time when relationships were anything but a place where you could relate. If Grandma and Grandpa, or great-great-great-Grandma and Grandpa, liked each other or loved each other, that was at the very bottom of a huge list of functions that marriage was supposed to fulfill. And if that happened, that was just an extra plus that most people just kind of were quite flabbergasted about and certainly didn't expect. But like I'm saying, in contemporary times, since most of those needs are met elsewhere, it seems to be the authentic relationship between two people. And perhaps that's why relationships are not lasting that long. There's nothing much to hold people together unless the quality of the relationship is really good. Of course, no one said love was going to be easy, but perhaps you're learning a little bit more about the important characteristics involved in close love relationships. But I want to finish this episode up with two additional kinds of questions that I've devised to help individuals basically evaluate the quality of their love relationships. Now, these are two questions I've developed through clinical practice and my work with couples over the years. And I think you'll find that they're very instructive when it comes to evaluating your personal relationship. So, I'll see you in a little bit. Now, the first of these questions is very simple. How free are you, or how free were you, to be your true self in the relationship? Your real, authentic, honest self. How free were you just simply to be what you naturally are? Well, of course, there are many ways that question could be answered, couldn't it be? At the very best, in the healthiest relationships, people have found a place where they can be their real self comfortably and acceptedly, and even being loved for what they seem to truly be. It's a very freeing place where one essentially can, be themselves, be authentic, express what's on their mind, both good and bad things, reveal both their weaknesses and strengths. But the relationship they're in is the one place in town where they feel the most comfortable to be themselves. But how rare that is. How few individuals can say that they can be completely free to be themselves around the person who claims, I guess, to love them the most. Now, for most of the rest of us, we find relationships, because of all the entanglements of day-to-day living, a place where we can be somewhat real, but not completely real. It doesn't take a couple long to begin to discover the certain areas that need to be avoided, the certain conversations that shouldn't come up, the certain discussions that might be better avoided, the certain areas of fighting and disagreement, political things, social things, raising the children, financial problems. The list goes on, and perhaps that's kind of normal in a sense, but it gets far worse than that. And I'm afraid in the average couple, people find themselves in a rather ironic predicament of finding themselves very unable to express and be themselves in their close love relationship. Now, you would think people would demand that would be the one place they could be the most real. And yet, unfortunately, so few people can report that. Many, many more, unfortunately, have to report that their relationship may be one of the most inhibiting places they know. Of all the places they can be, when they're with their spouse, it seems there's not much about themselves they can really be or express. After a while, it becomes quite clear there are all kinds of things that you shouldn't be doing, all kinds of friends you shouldn't really talk to, all kinds of jokes you tell at parties that you really just shouldn't, they're just stupid, all kinds of ideas you've got that are crazy, insane, just plain dumb, all kinds of things that you do, clothes that you wear, places you go, things you do at work, things you're not doing at work, things you're doing wrong, things you're not taking care of. Seems that some cases it gets so bad that there's hardly anything you can think of that you do is right. Everything about you seems somewhat bad or somewhat wrong or just not quite up to snuff. And therefore, when it comes to really expressing yourself, being authentic, sharing, there's not much left you can share. And you find yourself horribly inhibited and kind of confined by the relationship. And you have to admit, of all the places you know in town, being with your spouse is the last place you can be real. It's a horrible irony, but so often it seems to happen. You can be more free down at the corner bar. You can be more free with your work friends. You can be more free with your regular friends. You can be more free with total strangers on a bus than you can be with that person who claims to love you the most. Now, that's an interesting claim, isn't it? One would really wonder, or it might well be worth questioning, how much someone genuinely loves you if they can't find anything but fault with everything you say and do. Oh, they may genuinely feel or believe in their minds they love you, but it may well be more of an image of what you should or ought to be rather than what you really are. So, once again, the first question basically is, how free are you to be in yourself in the relationship? And if you found a situation, especially one that's going on now, bear in mind, my friends, that unfortunately at the beginning of almost every relationship, you're probably quite free to be yourself. When we first fall in love, during that period we know as the old sparkle period, it's an exciting time, and it's anything but real. We aren't probably being very real. We aren't really saying everything that is on our mind. We're probably busting our butt, so to speak, to please and to be pleasing and to be vivacious and to agree with almost anything, as insane and idiotic as it might be, that this newfound love is saying, because we're so enamored, and they're doing the same thing with us. Oh, all the little things that later on will become big gripes are fine now. Huh? You're an axe murderer? Oh, yeah. That's great. No problemo, right? Sure. Unfortunately, we all do ourselves a disservice in those initial times. And it leads to one of my other many famous quotes: the biggest mistake most people make in relationships is waiting to be honest. Waiting to be honest. Oh, we wait till we've walked them down the aisle in many cases before we spring on them what we really think. But at least we don't do it right away. We tend to be horribly compatible and agreeable and so on and so forth. But the sad part about it is we're deceiving not only ourselves but our potential mate. Guy, I love McDonald's, baby. Sure, that's your favorite place. Let's go right now. You hate it. You can't stand it. But you're going to go because you want to show what a good sport you are. and you make believe you really dig it. Well, 10 years down the road, you're finally going to have to look up one day and say, you know, I hate this place, but you've been coming along all these years. Where's the girl I married? She loved it here. The biggest mistake we make in relationships is waiting to be honest. How much better it would be if we could be a little bit more honest and, you know, direct from the beginning. But nonetheless, what I was suggesting, taking us back to an earlier point, is the idea that once a relationship has gone on, if we still find that we can be our real selves, we prize out a good one. Now, the second question that I use to judge the caliber of a relationship is as follows. How does the relationship, or did if it's in the past, how does the relationship affect your own self-esteem, your own self-concept, your own view of yourself as an individual? Now this is important because I'm talking about your self-concept as an individual, separate really from the relationship. Don't mistake this, as many people do, as being how you feel about being part of a team. You know, a lot of people get their esteem by whom they happen to be with. The doctor's wife, you know, married to a former Miss America, or whatever, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about your own individual sense of self-esteem, your own view of yourself as a person. Now here, once again, the answers to that question vary greatly. In the best relationships, and this is rare, in the best relationships, what we find is that your view of yourself has been actually enhanced by the relationship as a result of your partnership. You feel literally perhaps somewhat better about yourself, somewhat more adequate, somewhat more lovable, somewhat more, exciting, interesting, whatever. But in general, your self-esteem has been somewhat boosted by this relationship. It has done your psychology good in that sense. That's a very rare phenomenon. Most of us are lucky, basically, to maintain about the same level of self-esteem we had previous to the relationship. But unfortunately for many, many other people, a relationship can actually have an insidious, slowly developing negative effect on one's self-esteem. In other words, what typically happens as the relationship progresses is that you, in subtle sorts of ways, begin to feel worse about yourself as an individual than you ever did before. Some relationships are horribly devastating to one's self-concept. It gets to a point where you begin to feel that you're just not very attractive, you're not very sexy, you're not lovable, you're not interesting, you're not very exciting. You may be about as worthless and crummy as the relationship or your spouse or the constant bickering between you have come to make you feel. And sadly enough, this kind of deterioration can be so devastating that it leaves some individuals so weak and so helpless they can't get out of a rather negative marital situation. Well, that basically is the second question then. How has the relationship affected your own view of yourself? You know, if indeed you have maintained your basic level of self-esteem or it's actually increased, great, so much the better. If on the other hand you find it's slowly eroding, your self-esteem as well as the first question slowly kind of eroding or working away from your sense of being free and expressive, some very serious questions one needs to ask about those relationships. It's just beautiful here. I hope you've enjoyed this little journey to the tropics as much as I have being here delivering it for you. And this evening's episode, dealing with close love relationships, the number one source of personal happiness. There's a lot of disillusionment in relationships these days, but perhaps some of the pointers we've picked out have helped explain that to you. Next, episode we get together, we're going to continue our journey here in the tropics. That's why we're ending up right here instead of the normal studio. We're going to stay here on location, and we're going cruising, I guess. I've got to get back to the ship real quick. We'll be cruising to the fabulous Virgin Islands. And there we'll continue to examine close love relationships are number one, and visit a very special place, a place known as the Mountain of Love. So we'll see you then. Until then, much happiness. Yes, here we are in the fabulous Caribbean to find out what people on these islands think about the fabulous 14 fundamentals. Well, folks, what do you think of the fabulous 14 fundamentals?
Never heard of them.
That's right, Joe. We never heard of anything like that.